I'd like to welcome the mayor to Albany. It's good to see you. And I do have a series of information and questions for you. So you went through your testimony, and I listened to it very carefully. And you did point out there's some good things in the budget that you agreed with, but you also brought in a litany of complaints, things like Medicaid, CUNY, charter schools, transportation, capital, and the list goes on. And basically what you're saying is that you're demanding more money from the state's taxpayers, that you want more money. This year's budget proposal is a $322 million net positive for New York City, including $364 million in growth for school aid. And other investments also being made under this proposal, including the areas of housing, which you know I have a particular interest in, homeless programs, economic development, and transportation. So I'd like to go through some of the areas that you covered in your testimony, and I'd like to start with Medicaid. The state actually spends total $18.5 billion on the Medicaid program, and almost $12 billion of those funds go to New York City. We, as the legislature and the governor, has capped the growth of Medicaid to help local governments around the state, and they have to live within the constraints of the property tax cap, but the property tax cap does not apply to New York City. That's correct, right? So this year, New York City is collecting $3.5 billion more in property taxes than if it had the 2% property tax cap. So the mandate relief is going, I believe, in the wrong place, and the city clearly has the resources to pay a share of the Medicaid annual growth. And here are the numbers over the long term. Medicaid is expected to grow about 4.5%. We take actions to control costs and get the growth down to within our own Medicaid spending cap. This year it's about 3.5%. And I think what the budget is asking is for the city to share in a little bit of the growth, but still not as much as what we pay in our counties around the state. The state is capping New York City's growth at 2%, and the state will continue to pay any growth above 2%. And by the way, not coincidentally, 2% is the limit of the property tax cap. So we're living under constraint of property tax cap upstate. You don't have that constraint. And as a result, some of the poorest counties would be subsidizing people on Medicaid in New York City. And we have very poor counties upstate, so that's just wrong. So even after these proposals, the budget will still provide $631 million in mandate relief from the Medicaid program to New York City, and that, I may point out, is still more than last year. So I assume that you would prefer this year's budget over last year's budget because of $631 million in mandate relief.
Well, first of all, Chair, I want to thank you for the fact that we've obviously been in a close working partnership with you on housing issues. I know it is your passion, and want to thank you for the work we've done together.
Thank you.
On the questions you're raising now, I think it's important to start by saying I've had perhaps a different experience than some people who have held this particular role, in that I spent a part of my career working on the concerns of upstate as well, and different parts of the state, when I was the HUD regional director. And all of New York State was part of the area that I worked on during the Clinton administration. So I spent a lot of time in big cities and smaller cities and towns all over this state. And I absolutely understand that many parts of our state are struggling economically, just like the 46% of New York City residents who are at or near the poverty level. So we have challenges all around. I would argue that it would be very good in all of our discussion about this state, of course, to think like one state, to think about the needs of every type of New Yorker, and what we can do to maximize economic growth for all of us, for the good of all. I do think it's fair to say that New York City right now is providing a very positive impact on the rest of the state, economically and in terms of revenue. We're proud of that fact. What I'm trying to do in my budget is keep that going for all of us, to keep building our economy for the good of all residents of New York State. To do that, we have to have fiscal stability. The investments we're making in more police, for example, in improving our schools, and keeping housing affordable is also about our economic viability for the long haul. So I do think we're all interrelated deeply, and our ability to succeed affects everyone else, and everyone else's reality affects us. Now, what I would argue here is, because of what's happened in recent decades, we all know that if there is a downturn, God forbid, but we all know enough about economics to say it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. In the context of any downturn, there will be a very severe impact on our budgetary dynamic because it will start above us at the federal and state level. In a downturn, your revenues will be reduced, federal revenues will be reduced, and of course there'll be less for New York City, and then our own revenues go down. The reason I say this, in these scenarios, there is no safety net for us. There is no ability to turn to you and say, can you help us out in a jam? We'll know that you're not in a position to do that. So we have to have reserves, and we have to have fiscal stability. What I mentioned to you just between the change from our actuary and the immediate cost that we had to pay directly to address the problem of health in hospitals, that's $1 billion more in the current fiscal year's budget that was absolutely unforeseen a year ago. So I would argue to you that fairness from our point of view is to continue the state taking on responsibilities it has vis-a-vis Medicaid to help us ensure our fiscal stability for the good of all, but also with the recognition that in the event that there is a major financial challenge ahead, that we're in a position to handle it.
Thank you, Mayor, for that answer. But as I pointed out, there's still $631 million in mandate relief savings under Medicaid for New York City, and that's more than last year. I'd like to switch to CUNY because, as we know, CUNY stands for the City University of New York. And 71% of the students who go to CUNY are from the city, but the entire bill for the CUNY system is picked up by the taxpayers of New York State. That was a temporary arrangement and dates back to a time when New York City was in fiscal crisis and they could not afford CUNY. State stepped in and saved the CUNY system. Now the city has the resources, and we'll go over that in a few minutes about what your surplus is, to resume the support of CUNY. And the real question is at what level? So under the current structure, the city appoints 30% of the CUNY Board of Trustees, and under the budget, 30% of the cost we believe would be reasonable. So even though 70% of the CUNY students are from the city, state taxpayers will continue to pay for 70% of the operating costs. And in addition, the state expects to spend about $2.5 billion over the next 5 years on CUNY capital projects, which I think is very good. CUNY's capital program represents about 20% of all New York City construction today, so this state investment is huge for the New York City economy. So this, you know, this, under the CUNY part of the proposal, still are making out. Last year, the city had such a big surplus that you prepaid $3.6 billion of this year's expenses and put billions in reserves. And you just talked about why you want to do that. Each year, the city recognizes billions in additional revenue over its 4-year financial plan that you did not include when the budget was first adopted. And last year, that number was $11 billion. Right now, the city's fiscal watchdogs are projecting upwards of $2.5 billion in additional revenues for the city's upcoming budget. So you talked about the need to be fiscally prudent and squirrel away money, but the question is, you have this enormous surplus, and do you have a PEG program in place, which is a program to eliminate the gap? New York City agencies look for savings, look for cuts.
Okay.
Do you have that in place?
Let me speak. You raised several points, if I may. I'll try and speak to each of them quickly. First of all, we do contribute substantially to CUNY, and we have, and I want in a moment Dean Foulihan to outline that to you. Second, we believe that our contribution is consistent with what is our obligation in terms of the history, and certainly when it compares favorably to what's being done in other parts of the state. The fact is that we know, and I'll use a fact from the last economic downturn, when the Great Recession hit, the combined impact of lost federal and state aid and the cuts that were necessary in New York City and the tax increases that were necessary in New York City totaled about $12 billion over 2 years. Against that backdrop, we have laid in very heavy reserves, again, knowing with absolute respect that neither the state nor federal government will be in a position to come to our aid in that kind of scenario. I think it's a fair statement to say that New York City's ability to continue being an economic engine is of paramount strategic importance to the whole state. So we must maintain that stability. I don't think anyone here wants to see New York City slip backwards economically. And that's why we are so focused on these reserves. Dean Fullhan will give you a little more of our view of why we think what we're already contributing to CUNY is both substantial and fair.
So the takeover by the state of CUNY was actually a permanent takeover. It was similar to the senior college operations of the state university. The community colleges, we do contribute a third of everything that goes into the operations and a half of the capital budget of the community colleges, which is actually the exact same model that is used throughout the state. As a matter of fact, we are the only municipality that actually doesn't have a majority of the board of trustees of their local community college.
So it's
we
community
have a
colleges
third, and
versus
we
the
provide.
CUNY system, right?
That's correct. The community
Okay.
college is the model that's used throughout the state. It is the model that was adopted during the fiscal crisis in 1976 when the CUNY senior colleges were taken over, and the Board of Trustees also, the change
Right,
in
and
the
as you
Board of
point out, that's the
Trustees
same system that's across
also-
the entire state for
also
community colleges.
control the community colleges, which does not exist in your county, where the majority is actually of the local part, even though they also pay the 1/3 part. I would just also like to go back quickly on the Medicaid part. Just worth noting one more additional thing that the mayor pointed out to emphasize that we actually have between 2005 reform on Medicaid and the 2012 action on Medicaid, the state has completely taken over the entire administration and rate setting of Medicaid, including additional powers to actually set and control the very percentages that you are talking about. So we have no role in this other than the $5 to $6 billion that you're talking about that we contribute in.
But you're still getting substantial savings under this budget and mandate relief, and you don't have the constraints of the 2% property tax cap that all the other counties in the state have to live under, correct?
We pay income tax too, though.
Right. So Starcy MAC bonds, the state is committed to paying 100% of the debt service related to the Starcy bonds, and that's going forward. And when the bonds were refinanced, there were savings. And also I want to point out, state taxpayers will pay 100% of the $4.8 billion for the city's MAC bonds. And state taxpayers deserve every dollar of the savings. This should be obvious. It's like if your uncle pays the mortgage on your house when you refinance your house, who deserves the savings? I do want to go back, though, because we talked about you have nearly $5 billion in reserves, including $3.4 billion in retiree health benefits trust, $1 billion annually in your general reserve, which is an historically high level, $500 million in new capital stabilization reserve. You're benefiting from not having the property tax cap. You have upwards of $2.5 billion in potential additional revenues for the city's upcoming budget. So you're in a very, very good spot. But I did want to point out with your spending, because you are outpacing the state's fiscal restraint. As you know, we are under a voluntary 2% spending cap through the state budget. And however, the city's expenditures have increased at an average annual rate of more than 6%. And from 2011 to 16, city-funded expenditures adjusted for surplus transfers have grown at an average annual rate of 6.33%, as a matter of fact, and you compare that to the state spending of less than 2%. So you're in a great spot financially because you have all these surplus dollars, you're increasing spending over 6%. And again, I wanted to ask, because I asked it previously, I'm not sure I got the answer to it, but are you looking at your spending? Are you doing anything with the program to eliminate the gap called the PEG program with your city agencies to try to restrain some of the spending and find some savings for the taxpayers of New York City?
Okay, Senator, let me go over several points that you raised, if I may. First, on that point, Mr. Houlihan can outline the details. We had over $1 billion of savings that we identified in our preliminary budget proposal. We also have said very clearly we are looking seriously at a specific PEG strategy for the executive budget proposal in May, but not a minor matter that we found $1 billion in savings already. Second, some of the growth, a substantial amount of the growth in the budget is related to Hurricane Sandy matters, meaning we are passing through federal dollars from FEMA, from HUD, for Hurricane Sandy relief efforts. That is a temporary condition. When those federal dollars drop up, we anticipate that our budget will actually contract. We also, as you heard earlier, have brand new obligations that came on very suddenly that we are, by law, must abide by, obviously in the case of the city actuary, adding a $600 million charge for this year and every year thereafter. We have an immediate challenge related to health and hospitals. So that budgetary growth is in large measure because of federal funds that are short-term and because of new obligations that we have no choice but to meet. On your other questions, or the other points you made, on the way our tax system is oriented in the city, obviously one of the few places in the state with a personal income tax at the city level. I would say my colleagues here from the city would agree that our property tax rate plus our city income tax is certainly substantial for our taxpayers to have to handle. Finally, on the question of the $600 million on the MAC refinancing, this issue, we believe fundamentally, was settled in 2004 by the New York State Court of Appeals, which made clear that the state had an obligation through 2034, I believe it was, to continue a regular payment of $170 million per year to the city of New York. It was an agreement struck between the two levels of government. It was confirmed by the Court of Appeals. So we believe that has to be honored for the long term.
Thank you, Mayor, for those answers. You know, the bottom line is that the city is awash in money right now, and localities around the state, counties, cities, small cities, villages, towns, would only dream of having surpluses and have to live under the property tax cap. So I want to thank you for your answers, and
I'm sorry, Senator, could we just do a quick response to that last point, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
I just want to quickly add, the mayor talked about over $1 billion in the preliminary budget, with more savings to be found in the executive budget, and last year we did over $1.4 billion also in savings. PEG really is a plan to eliminate the gap, which the city has, and it's worth noting that in 18 we are projecting a $2.2 billion gap, and in 19 a $2.9 billion gap, and in 20 a $2.7 billion gap.
Thank you very much.
We also, and the prepayments happens to be under the accounting methods that the city uses. That's how we actually balanced, and those prepayments you talked about are exactly how we proposed in the preliminary budget a balanced budget for fiscal 17.
And finally, the Medicaid challenges that you raise. Let's be clear, our situation with our Health and Hospitals Corporation is only going to get more difficult because of larger things happening in federal and state policy. We would very much like to work with the state and join with the state in going to Washington for some of the fundamental changes we'll need. But in the meantime, the financial impact on the city will grow intensely. And again, we don't have a safety net to turn to. We will simply have to take on those costs. So I would just suggest that that's another challenge that will grow for us.
Thank you, Mayor.